Good morning and welcome to Across the Arts. I am your host, Patrick D. McCoy, and it is my honor to welcome to this series Dr. Ronald A. Crutcher, the 10th president of the University of Richmond. Dr. Crutcher is a national leader in higher education, a distinguished classical musician, and accomplished administrator. He became the 10th president of the University of Richmond in 2015. Throughout his career, he has actively promoted success, affordability, and inclusive excellence. Dr. Crutcher is also President Emeritus of Wheaton College in Massachusetts, and prior to Wheaton, he served as Provost and Vice President, for Academic Affairs at Miami University in Ohio. An accomplished cellist, he is a former member of the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra and several other symphonies. He currently performs in the US and in Europe with the Klemperer Trio. Of note, of his special milestones, I must note the fact that he is the first cellist to receive the Doctor of Musical Arts degree from Yale in performance, and he is the proud husband of Dr. Betty Neal Crutcher and the proud father of Sarah Crutcher. Now I could go on and on and on, but please join me in welcoming Dr. Ronald A. Crutcher. Good morning, Dr. Crutcher.
Good morning, Patrick. What a joy it is to be with you this morning.
Thank you so much. Now, I know that you do a lot of these interviews. Before we even got on, you were sharing that you're preparing for one coming up. So I know this question that I'm going to ask you is something you're probably teed up for and ready for. So, of course, you were doing all of those things that a university president does, and through administration and balancing all these different academic programs. And then, of course, like everybody else, the pandemic hit. So talk to me about what went through your mind and the adjustments that you had to make, particularly at the university.
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. Well, first of all, I would say to you that as you know, we've been talking. I've been thinking and talking a lot about this lately with my executive team. When I look back to March of 2020, late February, early March of 2020, uh, we actually thought that we extended our students' spring break by 1 week, and while we prepared our professors learn how to teach on Zoom, and then we said, okay, we're going to do this Zoom thing. You won't come back right away, but in a couple of weeks we'll bring you back to school. And then literally before we could implement that, we had to write them and say, well, guess what? We're not. You're not going to be able to come back to school until before the end of the semester. And at that point, graduation was still up in the air. And excuse me, at the University of Richmond, as at most universities, seniors are really excited about their senior year and commencement in particular. So the point I'm trying to make here is that as I look back on it, what is really quite interesting is that none of us could have foreseen at that particular time that we would be almost a year and a half. I mean, really, 3 semesters. Well, 2.5 semesters, right? Doing a combination of in-person and online teaching. So then the next thing we had to do, once we got, had everything taken care of in the spring semester, was what about next year? And we had hoped. Now, I am the chair of the board of the American Council on Education. And so starting last March, every single month, we would have a check-in as a board. And during those check-ins, we would have medical officials coming and talking to us. And I remember very clearly one of the first ones to come was a gentleman, an epidemiologist from the University of Minnesota, who's been on Face the Nation and other programs. And we were all sitting there waiting with bated breath to ask the question, can we open up in the fall? Right. And at that point in time, he said to us, well, we can't shut the whole country down. We have to learn how to live with this virus. And then shortly thereafter, he changed his tune, which made us all very nervous. So the thing is that there were lots of surprises during this time. And so what I had to do as a leader and with my leadership team is that we changed all of our protocols with respect to how we interacted with the faculty senate. I met every single week with the Faculty Senate Executive Committee. That would not have happened. Normally, it would be once a month, and we put together a task force to come up with some scenarios for the fall. You know, one was totally virtual. Another was a combination hybrid. And so, at the end of the day, we were able to get through the year with about 65+% of our classes, courses face to face, and the rest a combination of kind of hybrid online, et cetera. But it was quite a challenging and perilous time. Now, the other thing I would say personally is that initially I I was concerned about the disruption in my normal schedule. Normally, my wife and I travel 60% of the time for the university. Fundraising, doing alumni events, and I love to travel. And so I thought, what will this be like? Well, the great thing is, um, I've now become accustomed to working at home, and my wife and I have spent more time, quality time together than we have in the last 16 years, actually. My office is on the first floor of the president's home. Hers is on the second floor, but we have every meal together. It's been really quite advantageous in that regard. Um, and I think another advantage is that now in higher education, we've learned that we can use technology to help expand the ways that we engage alums and parents. So I think going into the future, we will at least, as you know, I'm stepping down in August, but in my mind, I think we should find ways to continue some of the engagement that we have had with alumni and parents using Zoom because it will allow them to participate in like special speaker series, in courses in ways that we would not have been able to engage them in the past.
That is so true. And I know we kind of started right with the pandemic, but also, of course, the racial unrest and it's sort of all of that compounded the pandemic as well. And, being that the University of Richmond is there in Richmond, I know if I'm not mistaken from my travels, it's off of West Hampton Way and it's on the other side of town. But could you maybe speak to, if at all, how the University of Richmond was affected by the activity that went down right in the city,
Yeah.
as far as the protests and so forth?
Well, Patrick, early on, as I was communicating to our constituents several times, I reminded people that we were dealing with actually three huge challenges. You know, the most serious global pandemic since 1918, a serious economic downturn that we hadn't experienced since probably 2008, 2009, and then some of the most intense uh, racial and social justice activism since probably the civil rights movement. And the way this was intertwined with us, as you know, that last year, in last May, June, July, that the monuments on Monument Avenue were removed, all but the Robert E. Lee monument. Well, the monuments to Confederate soldiers were removed. The Arthur Ashe monument is still there, and the Robert E. Lee monument is still there too because there's been a suit. And many of our faculty and staff and students marched and are engaged in some of the Black Lives Matter marches. In fact, my wife and I have a condominium right across from Monroe Park. You probably know where that is, down near
Yes.
VCU. That's
Mhm.
where all the marches started, right across from our condo. Um, Now, on our campus, what we've been dealing with is a naming issue, which you may have read about too. That we have two buildings on the campus that were named for. One was named for someone who was an enslaver. He was our first president. The other named for, and that's his name is Robert Ryland. And then the other person was Douglas Southall Freeman, winner of two Pulitzer Prizes, writer of several biographies. But he was one of the founders, one of the persons who set the stage for the massive resistance movement. He was a eugenicist and obviously supported segregation. And uh, so that has really and the approach that we were trying to take at the university is that I suggested changing the Freeman name to Mitchell Freeman because
Mm.
in the research that we did, we learned that a black man, John Mitchell, whose name you may know, John Mitchell was the editor of the Richmond Planet, was a black newspaper for in Richmond, and at every opportunity he provided a counterpoint to Douglas Southall Freeman. I mean, he was in Freeman's face constantly, and in fact, in some cases, he would take editorials that Freeman had written, and then he would add a rejoinder to those. So I
Mm.
spoke to his descendants. They were very pleased about that decision. Now, let me be clear about one thing. The reason I suggested the Mitchell Freeman was that I was trying to thread a needle
Mm.
because I knew that there were the powers that be didn't want to change the name, but I felt we needed to do something to provide some context for understanding Freeman. I feel differently about the Ryland name because Ryland did a lot of great things, but kind of good things. As you know, yes, he was an enslaver, but he also was the pastor of the largest Black Baptist church in Virginia,
Wow.
and as that first African Baptist church. And as a pastor, he allowed his enslaved parishioners to teach each other to read and write, which was against the law at the time. He
Mm.
also helped several enslaved persons to gain their freedom. So that's a mixed story. And what we were going to do is tell the entire story. But our the students were not satisfied with that. And so we've had some really good conversations in the spring semester about these issues. I still believe very strongly that rather than sweeping the history under the rug, you need to bring it out to the light of day, see it for what it is. Because quite frankly, what I don't, you know, that residence hall was named for Douglas Southall Freeman in 1965. That wasn't that long ago. And so I want people to understand that good people, good, decent citizens made a decision to name that hall after this man who was a eugenicist and a segregationist. Because you could easily forget that, and who knows what might happen in the future.
Thank
So
you,
that's
Dr.
an ongoing; those are ongoing conversations on our campus.
Yes, yes, and I'm so happy that you lifted it up. But now I want to come directly back to you because I'm gonna tell you something. As I mentioned, when you became the president of U of R, and I'm living here in the Washington area, but I was like, oh my goodness, this brother is the president of U of R. I was so happy. But of course, I will admit, and I'm sure some new listeners may be finding out for the first time that you are a very fine cellist. And the thing that really brought my attention to you was Facebook, because one day I was on Facebook and I got this notification, and you were in your study playing one of these quarantine concerts. What inspired you? I know, of course, you're a cellist and it's the quarantine, but you could have been doing so many other things. What really inspired you to do those concerts?
Well, actually, it was some requests from our alumni. Quite frankly, I've played every semester, every year I've been here. I've played on campus at least once each semester in some fashion. Not a full recital. I played one full recital, and my trios played a concert on the campus. But for parents or for alumni or at the opening convocation. And so when I got several requests from alumni and parents, and I thought I'm going to do this. And just because for me, I find that music was very helpful during the early days of the pandemic. I mean, it was quite frightening because we didn't know what was going on, right?
Mm.
And sadly, we weren't getting much leadership from our government either. And so I thought this would be something that I could share with our alumni and our parents. And then it turned out that we also included VCU alumni on it as well. And I sent it to my German family. I used to live in Germany, and I lived with one family there for 3 years, and so they're like family to me. And I sent it to them, so they were watching as well. It was really, really, I felt really good about doing that, and it was cathartic for me too, quite frankly, right? And so and I'll tell you something that I didn't realize. There is something called Room Rater. You might know about this. I'd never heard of it
Mm.
before. And somebody on Room Rater gave me a 10. I asked my friends, what does this mean? I have no idea what that is, but it was
So it's
enjoyable.
like a rating system? Because I
Yeah,
actually, this is the first time I heard of it from you. So you just taught me
yeah.
something
It's
new.
it's a rating system. Apparently, there are people when you do things on Facebook or Twitter, they rate your room if you're in wherever you are. Who knew? I knew nothing about that, but it was a lot of fun. I enjoyed it immensely, and people I got lots of positive letters and notes from people about it.
As you should. Thank you so much. Now, I want to ask you a few questions because as I was reading up on you, and I would like to talk a little bit more about your family life because as we know that we definitely don't get to these levels without our parents and the nurture of our parents. Would you mind just sharing a little bit about your parents' influence on your work ethic?
Yes, yes, absolutely. So I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio. My mother and father were from Kentucky. Like a lot of African Americans, they migrated from the South to, they didn't go very far from Kentucky. They lived in Patontown, Kentucky, which is
Mm.
between Richmond and Berea, Kentucky, and they had known each other since they were teenagers. My father fell in love with my mother when he was about 13 years old. And neither of my parents went to college, but they were they very ambitious for their children. They made certain that we got to go to the Cincinnati Symphony, to the Children's Theater, to the Art Museum. They both loved art. The art. My mother loved opera. My father was a semi-professional singer. My first musical experiences were in elementary school at the age of 6 when I was asked to sing at church. And I really didn't realize that I had any musical talent. But back in the 50s, when your elder tells you to do something, you did it. So Miss Mathis said, "You will sing Holy Bible Book Divine at evening service." And so I stood up and I sang Holy Bible Book Divine. And I loved. I mean, people were just oohing and eyeing over me. Oh yeah, such a pretty, beautiful voice, etc. I had no idea. But it wasn't until I was 14 years old that I started playing the cello, and that's where my uh, the culture that I grew up in my home, the conditions under which I grew up. I mean, my father was a very kind of um, to be honest, when I was growing up, I thought he was mean, but he was very disciplined, and we had everything scheduled on the weekends, uh, and um, uh, and so I was already accustomed to that when I first started playing the cello at age 14, and I fell in love with the instrument and couldn't put it down. And several months later, I played the first two movements of the Bach suite at Miami University at a competition sponsored by the Ohio Music Educators Association. The cello professor at Miami University happened to be there, and she eventually offered to teach me free of charge if my parents would get me from Cincinnati to Oxford. And she developed a relationship with my parents. My mother and father um, had observed how much I practiced, and kind of sensed that I must have had some talent. But she kind of reassured them that I was incredibly talented. Um, then I'll tell you this story. After starting playing to play with her, so I would go up every Saturday morning at 7:40. I'd get on the bus. It'd take an hour and a half to get there, and I'd stay and not come home until 6 p.m. So about a month into taking lessons from her, she said, "You have to have your own cello." I was using a K cello from school, and she explained that the K was made out of plywood, blah 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 blah. And so at the dinner table one evening, I said to my father, "Miss Pottinger says I need to have my own cello, and I've already found a cello, Mr. Eichstadt down at the string shop has a cello. It costs $250. Dad went down and he bought the cello for me. I was thrilled, of course. A year later, she says to me, "You've outgrown this cello. You need a better instrument." And I thought, "Oh my God, how can I tell my dad this about this?" So I went to Mr. Eichstatz again. He had three cellos that were priced between $800 to $1,000, three new cellos. I wrote my father a note. I was afraid to ask the person. And I asked him to meet me downtown at Mr. Eichstatz after a competition that I was in. And I got there. I asked Mr. Eichstadt if he'd seen my father. No, I haven't seen your father, but come on back. I have the cellos. I walked back, and there was my dad sitting. And he said, choose the instrument that you want. And he took out a loan to buy me that instrument. And of course, at that age, I was 15, 16 then. I was so excited about getting the cello. It didn't occur to me that this was you know, quite a sacrifice, given that I wasn't the only child in the family. I was the oldest of three. But that's I think my parents, knew how committed I was. And of course, I took the cello home. I played all night. They didn't say anything. They let me do it. They didn't interrupt me. I mean, I was very, very fortunate. They were always incredibly supportive. They always showed up whenever I played concerts. I'll tell you another story when I was in undergraduate school. So I went to Miami University and I played a concerto with the orchestra. And at this point, my father uh, had been promoted to become the first Black manager at the Cincinnati Millicron, but he had to work at night. That's the only opening they had. So my mother wasn't sure, was had just learned how to drive, and to get to Oxford in those days, it was a winding road that had to go down a kind of a mountain. So she said, "I don't know if I'm going to be able to come." Well, this was a concerto for two cellos. As we were walking out onto the stage and sitting down, I looked up and I saw my mother and my little brother walk in the auditorium. I mean, those little things you never forget. Those are two examples. I mean, my parents were always supportive, and most importantly, what they did for us as children is that they ensured that we knew that we were loved unconditionally, and that's
Mm.
something no one can ever take away from you.
Oh my goodness, you just pulled at my heartstrings because I'm sure that everybody can relate to the sentiment that your parents are your biggest fans. And then the other thing that we share, neither one of my parents graduated from college either, but they fostered and supported all of their
Yeah.
children. So thank you for lifting that up. Now I want to go back to your teacher, Miss Pottinger, and the fact that she was so nurturing to you. But I also want to move to this experience of Carnegie Hall. It's like everybody's dream to perform at Carnegie Hall. And I know that you did this when you were in your youth, but what was that like for you walking on that stage?
Well, and it wasn't all that. I mean, I was by that time I had our daughter was here, so I was in my 30s. But and
Oh,
I had lived in Germany. I'd lived in Germany for 5 years and played in great concert halls there. And I'm a meditator. And I also believe when I perform, I try to visualize what it's going to be like. And so what helped me through, because I was afraid I'd get on stage and just be so nervous I couldn't play. But I just kept thinking, I've played in great concert halls all around well, at least in Europe and the Soviet Union. At that time, it was called the Soviet Union. And so, Carnegie Hall was just another concert hall. And that really helped me through it. I'm a real proponent of kind of visualization, trying to visualizing what it's going to be like, and try to conjure up those feelings so you can practice them right before you go out onto the stage. Because I learned. I mean, I have never had any problem with nerves, and I remember when I went to Yale on my first recital there, I got nervous, and it really rattled me. And so from that experience, what I learned is not to take it. Don't take for granted that you're not going to be nervous. Assume that you're going to be nervous. So prepare yourself for it. And that's when I started doing the visualization and the meditation and stuff like that. Um, But so Carnegie was not that, well, it turned out not to be that big of a deal. I mean, it was a big deal in terms of the quality of the sound and just being in that space, obviously, but it wasn't as overwhelming as I thought it might be.
Wow. So let's go back, or rather to push forward, because you mentioned Yale, of course, your education there. But we have another interesting connection that I want you to make. And it was such a breath of fresh air when you mentioned the time that you had the kind of the HBCU connection with Yale. Could you share that with the listeners?
Yes, yes. Well, I mean, I've always been one of those individuals, and this is probably, I got this from my father, to try to, I don't sit around and expect and wait for opportunities to come to me. I seek them out. And so when I was at Yale, one of the things we did was we founded the Black Music Students Union because I got to Yale and I'm sure there was a compilation of lots of things happening, civil rights movement at that time. The Black Panther, Bobby Seale was in jail in New Haven. I was involved in the demonstrations there, et cetera. But it occurred to me that I'd gone through university and I really knew very little about African American music. And so we founded this Black Music Students Union, all five of us. And we met with the dean, and I said, we need to have someone to teach a course in African American music. And they did that. It was a really terrific experience learning about African American music. But beyond that, we also had to, in addition, we had other things that we were other priorities that we had in mind too, and in addition to learning about African American um, music. And so, um, what I don't want to get into all the stuff that we did, but I heard about a grant from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, and the intention of the grant was to recruit graduate students at Yale. So I went to the person who was heading up the grant and I made a proposal and I said, why don't you send members of our Black Music Students Union to HBCUs to play concerts, and then we'll recruit students, not just music students, we'll recruit students from all across the university as part of this grant. And the person bought the idea. So I was able to visit HBCUs it wasn't actually the first time. The first time I was on an HBCU campus was when I was a senior in high school. At the age of 16, I got my first professional job playing in the Dayton Philharmonic Orchestra. And we did a performance of the Mendelssohn's Elijah and the Central State University Choir. Central State is where Leontine Price, I see her photograph up next to your left ear. That Leontine Price graduated from Central State. So and as part of that concert, we went to Central State to perform. So I had been on their campus, but I hadn't been to Morehouse, I hadn't been to Spelman, Fisk, Virginia State. It was wonderful experience. And as I told you, at Virginia State, the great Dr. Undine Smith-Moore and Dr. Altoona Trent Johns were our hostesses. It was a transformative experience for me. It really was. And we were able to recruit Kay George Roberts, the famous Black conductor. I recruited her to Yale. Portia Schuler, well, she has a different name now, a pianist from Fisk. I recruited her to Yale, and several other folks. So it was a great experience for me. We went to Tougaloo, Talladega, Morehouse at Spelman, Virginia State, Virginia Union. It was fantastic.
I love the fact that you've really been laying this work, you doing this work, even, I mean, before it even became a thing during the pandemic, because I love the fact that now, because of the pandemic and the different things that have happened, you have these institutions that are now making these connections between the HBCU and your quote unquote PWI institution. So that is so fascinating to me. So thank you, Dr. Crutcher, for sharing that. And I want to move ahead because something else that you've been doing, or I guess maybe in the beginning, you wrote a book. You wrote a book, And I want you to talk about this book, a little. I know there's a lot that you can say because, as the listeners have been hearing you, you've had a lot of different experiences in leadership in top positions, institutions. But this book title got me. I had no idea you were Black. Talk to me.
Okay. Well, first of all, yesterday I was actually in D.C. At McGuire Woods for a Leaders of Color panel, along with Wade Henderson and Joan Mulholland. I talked about it. So the title itself, it comes from an experience I had when I was head of the Butler School of Music at the University of Texas at Austin. I was interested in getting some money from a foundation that provided funds to support violinists. And I had in particular in mind a Black violinist who had come to UT Austin and had been with me, or I'd known her at the Cleveland Institute of Music. So it took me 2 years to get this appointment. I go to Houston. The man who's the chair of the board is a CEO of an oil company. I'm in his office. I had just shaken his hand, and I was literally lowering myself to my seat when he looked at me and he said, "I had no idea you were Black." And so I thought, okay, that's an interesting way to begin the conversation. Let me just take a deep breath. My father used to always teach us that when somebody says something to you that knocks you off your feet, don't respond right away. Take a deep breath, just take a pause. So rather than responding, I paused and he said, "Perhaps you can help me. My wife and I have been going to the Aspen Music Festival for 30 years, and we rarely see any Black violinists. Why is that?" And I was able to talk about why that was, talk about what we were doing at the University of Texas, most importantly, talk about this young violinist, and eventually we got the money. In fact, this young violinist now is a member of the viola section in the Cleveland Orchestra, a very talented young woman. But I use it as a cautionary tale with my mentees. I've used it over the years. And I ask them, questions like, what's another way that he could have kind of entered into this conversation? What do you think might have happened if I had gotten upset and left? To get them to understand that a lot of times, particularly when you're dealing with differences across race or culture, people will say things that are awkward and that may sound like, oh, that may take you aback. Um, but rather than jumping to the conclusion that there was malcontent there, sometimes it's worthy of just engaging in a conversation with them, listening to what they really meant to say, or thinking about or asking them, why did you ask that question, for instance, right? If you don't. Those, so you can now, there, yes, there are times when people will say things like that when, it's not worth your time, right? And it's hard to discern that. Um, so I mean, to me, that's the way I live my life. I mean, I enjoy encountering people who have differing perspectives from me, as long as they're willing to listen and be reasonable. They don't have to agree with me. I tell folks all the time, I learned a long time ago how to agree to disagree with folks. I can be your friend and still not agree with you on everything, and that's perfectly fine.
I had a similar story, and I want to keep this about you, but when you said the whole thing about basically keeping your composure, not responding, when I first started writing, when I was mostly doing online, I remember I was in a situation where I met somebody who later became the associate publisher who hires me, but he says to me, it's good to write for a blog, but it's good to be in print. And a lot of times when people call your work, you write for a blog, sometimes writers get very defensive. So that made me think about that. You never know the great opportunity that lies ahead, but you have to keep your mouth silent. So thank you so much. Excuse me. So as we go to wrap up, Dr. Crutcher, I definitely want to be respectful of your time, and I thank you so much. As we wrap up, I want to talk about, of course, as you mentioned, or I think I alluded to, that this is your sixth and final year at the University of Richmond as president. You've done a wonderful job, you and your wife, both at leading and shepherding the university. What would you say you would maybe consider your signatures that maybe were not done before that you're leaving behind for the next administration?
Mhm. Oh, wow. Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the things I would say is that um, when I came to the University of Richmond, I knew, so I'd been the president of Wheaton College for 10 years, but more importantly, I was a so-called leader in higher education. I'd been the chair of the board of the AACNU, the Association of American Colleges and Universities, very much engaged, very well connected, right? And yet I knew very little about the University of Richmond other than that it had the first undergraduate leadership school, the Judson School of Leadership Studies. And I was very pleasantly surprised to learn that as I learned more about it and got engaged, that the quality of the education offered here is just as good as at the top 10 liberal arts colleges in the university. But and yet people didn't know, weren't aware of that. And uh, so basically, to make a long story short, I think I found out that why that was. It's because we didn't have anybody looking at communications and marketing for the entire university. The marketing and communications unit was located in fundraising. And so I asked the board to allow me there to elevate that position to a vice president. And so to make a long story short, we recruited someone from Baylor University, a seasoned person who's been fantastic. And I think that's one of the reasons why we've risen from number 32 in the U.S. News and World Report to number 22. I mean, not that the U.S. News and World Report is and the all that end all. I wish it didn't exist, but the fact is it does exist. I think the other thing the other legacy that I'm leaving is a real a commitment to making excellence inclusive, that and evolving to a truly inclusive community, that and we're still on that journey. In my inaugural address, I recognize the fact that the University of Richmond, in a very short period of time under my predecessor, had become far more diverse than ever before. I mean, they went from 9% Pell Grant eligible to about 16% in about 7 years, 11% students of color to about 24, 25% students of color in that same period of time. But I said to them, the challenge was now we have to use this rich diversity to change the culture of the institution. It's not enough just to have representational diversity. That's just the first step. Now we have to ensure that everyone, regardless of their race, their background, their sexual orientation, their political persuasion, everyone feels as though they belong at the University of Richmond, that it's their university, that they're not a guest in someone else's home. And we're still evolving. Now, what I wish I had said at the time, this was 2015, the fall, I wish I'd reminded people that this doesn't happen in 5 or 10 years. It takes a while. You have to really work. But we have a plan of making excellence inclusive plan. And I've also developed several different academic initiatives on the campus. One of the things that I'm very proud of, uh, again, an observation I made when I came to the university, we had fewer than five Fulbright scholars. Now, I came from Wheaton, which for 10 years in a row had been one of the top 10 producers of Fulbrights amongst liberal arts universities. And I felt the University of Richmond students were just as good, if not better, than Wheaton students. So I started an office called the Office of Scholars and Fellowships. And the goal is to be more proactive and working with students to introduce them to the fellowships and scholarships that are available, to coach them, work with their applications, because sometimes even with the best students, you have to nudge them, right? And so as a result of that, for 3 years in a row, we've been one of the top producing Fulbright institutions in our category for both students and faculty, and we've gotten all kinds of other national awards. So those are just three that I would mention.
Well, thank you. And I kind of got ahead of myself because I have to bring up this point for us to discuss you being a stellar string player. And of course, what I have noticed through the pandemic, you've seen more opportunities or more exposure rather of Black string players being amplified in science, particularly with the work of Sphinx. And I want to shout out to Aaron Dworkin and Dr. Quentin Morris, if I'm not mistaken, interviewed you twice. So I had a rubric to go through and listen to. But I want to talk to you. What are some of the things that you would like to continue as far as accessibility for our Black string players? Because sometimes people would say, oh, there are no Black string players. Oh, whatever. But there are plenty of Black string players. You just have to reach out to them.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I think I am. I have two things I'd mention. First, that I continue to, I'm an artistic advisor for Sphinx, and they do great work. I'm a real champion of the Sphinx, and my wife and I support them philanthropically as well. And I think they're doing the best job of anybody in the country. But the second thing is, I just participated in something that just is very, very unique and new, and it's being funded by Sphinx. The Cleveland Institute of Music has developed a future faculty institute, and I was in the inaugural meeting of that institute. It was supposed to be in person. Sadly, it's now it's being done by Zoom, but nonetheless, there are 30 upcoming music professors, future music professors that we're working with. Some are still students, some are professors, and they're important because they're going to nurture other folks, right, and in the area. And so the bigger point is mentoring is incredibly important. So I always make it possible for me. I'll give you an example. I read a story in our local newspaper, the Richmond Times Dispatch, about a young Black man who was a cellist who got a scholarship to go to UNCG, which is, of course, where I taught for 11 years. And so I called the Richmond Times Dispatch, and they helped me to get in contact with this young man. And so I've met with him on Zoom a couple of times. And before the end, he goes back to school, I'm going to meet with him face to face as well. So I do everything I can when I to support young people young Black string players in particular, but Black musicians in general. I mean, because I want to be as helpful and useful as they possibly can to them. Because mentorship, that's one of the themes in my book. My book is not a biography, an autobiography. It's a thematic memoir, and the themes are leadership, and particularly leadership across as a Black man, mentorship, and of course, obviously careers in music.
Dr. Crutcher, it has been such a joy to have you on Across the Arts. Thank you so much. And I'm just so elated, for this time. And again, I hope that you all listening, you will buy Dr. Crutcher's book, I Had No Idea You Were Black. And the fact that it has these themes being lifted up, that makes me want to start a little online book club. Don't hold me to it, but I'm going to try.
Hey, there you go.
With all of these
hey, and let me also say, if anybody is watching who's in Atlanta, I'm actually doing a book signing tomorrow at Book Boutique in Atlantic Station from 1 to 6 tomorrow. Yeah, Book Boutique.
And this is in person. So that'll be a great opportunity.
Yeah.
Get the memoir signed. And if you feel so led, get one signed from me and mail it to me. We'll talk about that offline. But Dr. Crutcher, thank you so much. Again, you've been listening to the Conversation Series, a dialogue with Dr. Ronald A. Crutcher, the 10th president of the University of Richmond. Oh, and one thing I want to ask, as you leave the University of Richmond, because I know some people might catch that, you said you like to travel and you've done all of these other administration things. Talk to me. Do you have any things on the horizon?
Yes. Good question. So I had a 5-year contract initially, and then I signed a contract to extend an extension for 2 years. But because of COVID, we started the search early. So we actually found my successor in February. So I agreed to step down this August as opposed to in 2022, and as a result of that, I get 2 years of sabbatical. And so the first year I'll spend going back and forth between here and Atlanta. We have a condominium in Atlanta. I'm going to be doing a lot of book talks, and what's happening now is I'm doing a lot of talks where I'll play about a half an hour of music with my pianist, and then someone will interview me about my book, just as you are doing. And then I'm also going to be doing some things internationally. In September, I'm going to Romania to give a speech on behalf of the American Council on Education. And I'm going back to Berlin, where I lived in 2014, 2015. And then in the spring, I'm going to Zurich to go do a speech at a leadership conference, and then going back to Berlin for 2 lectures. So we'll be there again for 2 weeks. And then, so the next year, my wife and I will actually go to Berlin for the entire year, which is what we did in 2014, 2015.
Amazing. Looks like the heavens have opened up for you these opportunities. Thank you so much, Dr. Crutcher. Again, you have been listening to the conversation series on Across the Arts. I'm your host, Patrick D. McCoy, and I hope that you would stay tuned as we announce very soon the next guest of the Opera Diva series, as well as the conversation series. Thank you so much, and we look forward